It was a sunny afternoon when Flight 319 took off from New York, heading toward Los Angeles. Among the many passengers on board was Carmen Taylor, a woman who appeared calm and collected, dressed in an elegant but simple business outfit. She had always been a private person, preferring to let her work and intelligence speak for themselves rather than flaunting her wealth. But no one knew that she was the daughter of Lucius Taylor, a billionaire who owned a massive airline empire. Carmen had been looking forward to a peaceful flight, hoping to relax after a busy week of meetings. She settled into her first-class seat, placed her handbag on the floor, and adjusted her seatbelt. Little did she know, her flight would soon become anything but peaceful. As passengers continued to board, one of the flight attendants, a young woman, greeted Carmen with a polite smile. The crew seemed to be in a rush, and Carmen didn't think much of it. But then, the flight captain, Captain Edward Stone, walked into the first-class cabin. He was in his late 40s, tall with short gray hair, and dressed in his pilot uniform. He had a confident stride, but something about his expression felt off. Captain Stone scanned the cabin, his eyes briefly landing on Carmen. Without saying a word, he walked toward her. Carmen raised an eyebrow, wondering why he was approaching her seat. As he stood in front of her, he looked down at her, almost with a sense of judgment. "Miss, you're late to board. Please make sure to arrive on time in the future," Captain Stone said sharply, not even bothering to greet her properly. Carmen, slightly taken aback, looked up at him. She had arrived well before the flight's boarding time, and she was confused by the captain's comment. She wasn't sure if it was just a misunderstanding or if he was simply having a bad day. She decided to stay calm. "I'm sorry if there was any confusion, but I was on time. I've been seated for a while now," Carmen replied politely, hoping to end the brief conversation without any tension. But instead of apologizing or acknowledging her response, Captain Stone's face hardened. He glanced around, making sure no one was paying too much attention, before he muttered, "Just be sure to follow the rules next time." Carmen, who always believed in keeping her composure, didn't respond. She thought to herself that it was just one of those things. However, the situation didn't stop there. During the flight, Carmen noticed Captain Stone walking past the first-class section a few times. Each time, he gave her a cold glance. It didn't make her feel comfortable, but she ignored it and focused on her work. But it was becoming clear that Captain Stone had an attitude problem. At one point, he entered the cabin again, this time with an air of authority. He looked directly at Carmen and said, "I need you to move your bag from the aisle. It's a safety hazard." Carmen, slightly annoyed by his tone, replied calmly, "I'm not blocking anything. My bag is under the seat in front of me, and there's plenty of space." Captain Stone's face turned red with irritation. "I said move it," he snapped, his voice rising a little louder than necessary. Passengers around them began to notice the tension in the air, and whispers started to spread. Carmen, not wanting to escalate the situation further, simply stood up and moved her bag. But inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the way the captain was treating her. This was just the beginning of what would soon turn into a much bigger issue. As the flight continued, Carmen tried to forget about the uncomfortable encounter with Captain Stone. She had a lot on her mind: business deals, meetings, and other responsibilities. She didn't want to let the captain's rude attitude ruin her journey. She relaxed back into her seat, opened her laptop, and began reviewing some documents for an upcoming presentation. However, she couldn't shake the feeling that Captain Stone was still watching her. Every time he walked through the cabin, his eyes would linger just a little too long, and there was something about the way he looked at her that felt judgmental, almost as if he didn't think she belonged in first class. Carmen tried to focus on her work, but she couldn't ignore the discomfort building inside her. She had dealt with rude people before, especially in the business world. But something about Captain Stone's attitude felt different. He wasn't just being unprofessional. There was a quiet arrogance about him that seemed to carry the weight of an unfair judgment. As the flight progressed, the tension between them grew. Captain Stone made a few more trips through the cabin, always making sure to walk past Carmen's seat with that same cold, piercing stare. She couldn't understand what she had done to provoke him. She hadn't spoken to him beyond their initial interaction, and she had made sure to follow all the rules. But every time their eyes met, she felt like he was silently accusing her of something. Then, about an hour into the flight, Captain Stone came to the front of the cabin again, this time to speak to one of the flight attendants. As he passed Carmen's seat, he stopped abruptly, turning toward her. His voice was louder this time, more forceful than before. "Miss, I need you to put away your phone," he said, his tone harsh. Carmen, taken aback by the sudden demand, looked up. "I'm not using it," she replied calmly. "It's just sitting on the armrest. It's off." Captain Stone's expression hardened. "I don't care if it's off or not. I need you to follow the rules." Carmen felt her patience wearing thin. She had been calm and respectful throughout the flight, but now it was starting to feel like he was looking for a reason to cause trouble. She knew she wasn't doing anything wrong, but she also didn't want to escalate the situation further. "Captain Stone," Carmen said, keeping her voice even, "I assure you, my phone is not a problem. I haven't been using it, and it's not in anyone's way." But Captain Stone wasn't listening. His gaze grew even more intense, and he stepped closer, standing over her. "I said, put it away." At this point, the other passengers started to notice the situation. A few exchanged worried glances, and one woman quietly whispered to her neighbor, "Why is he being so rude to her?" Carmen was frustrated. She hadn't done anything to deserve this kind of treatment, but she knew that arguing with the captain in front of everyone wasn't going to help matters. Instead, she took a deep breath and carefully placed her phone in her bag, hoping that would end the confrontation. However, Captain Stone didn't seem satisfied. He lingered for a moment, his eyes still fixed on Carmen, before he turned and walked away without another word. Carmen could feel the tension in the air, but she stayed calm, refusing to let the captain's poor behavior get the best of her. Despite the uncomfortable atmosphere, Carmen focused on her work again, trying her best to ignore the unpleasantness that had clouded her flight. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a much larger problem. The captain's attitude wasn't just rude, it was becoming personal. And Carmen was beginning to wonder how far he was willing to take it. As Flight 319 continued its journey across the sky, the mood in the cabin had shifted. Passengers had noticed the strange tension between Carmen and Captain Stone, and whispers started circulating. Most of them had no idea what had caused the friction, but it was clear something wasn't right. Some passengers felt uncomfortable with the captain's attitude, while others sympathized with Carmen, quietly wondering who she really was. Carmen, however, remained composed. She had always known how to handle difficult situations, and she was determined not to let Captain Stone's behavior distract her from what she needed to do. She focused back on her laptop, reviewing the important business documents that had brought her onto this flight. But even as she worked, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the stares and glances around her. It was as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Although Carmen didn't show it, her mind wandered back to the past, her upbringing, her family, and the world she came from. She had always kept a low profile, not wanting her wealth or status to define her. To the public, Carmen Taylor was simply a successful businesswoman with a reputation for being sharp and intelligent. But few people knew that her success was built on the foundation of her family's empire. Her father, Lucius Taylor, was a name that carried weight in the business world. As the founder and owner of a massive airline conglomerate, he had built a legacy that spanned continents. Lucius had worked hard, starting with nothing but his vision and determination, and over the years, he had grown his company into one of the largest airline operations in the world. His influence reached far beyond the travel industry, and he was known as a powerful, respected figure in many sectors. Carmen had been raised with the values of hard work and humility, qualities her father had always emphasized. She had worked her way up in the business world, not relying on her family's wealth to get ahead, but instead proving herself through her own talents and achievements. However, because of her father's status, Carmen was often treated with curiosity, and sometimes even skepticism. People often assumed that she had only succeeded because of her last name, but Carmen knew better. She was proud of her accomplishments, which were hers alone. Though she never flaunted her wealth, Carmen was well aware of the privileges her family's success had afforded her. But her wealth wasn't what defined her. It was her intellect, her drive, and her ability to think outside the box that had earned her a place at the table with the most successful entrepreneurs in the world. And yet, she still faced challenges like anyone else, especially in situations like the one she was currently enduring. Meanwhile, the passengers around her continued to speculate. Some were curious about her background, wondering why the captain had singled her out so harshly. The whispers slowly grew louder, and one of the older women in the seat beside Carmen leaned over with a quiet question. "Excuse me," the woman began, her voice soft but eager. "I couldn't help but notice. Are you someone important? You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but you seem different. Like you're used to handling business matters." Carmen smiled politely, but she kept her response vague. "I'm just a businesswoman," she said, not wanting to draw attention to herself. But the truth was, she was far more than that. And soon, the rest of the cabin would learn exactly who she was. Little did they know, the events that were unfolding on Flight 319 would soon reveal the truth in a way that no one, not even Captain Stone, could have imagined. As the flight moved further along, Carmen had hoped that the awkwardness between her and Captain Stone would fade away. But instead, it seemed to only grow. The captain continued to make his rounds through the cabin, each time walking by her with that same cold, unfriendly expression. He never once apologized for his earlier rudeness, and Carmen began to feel the weight of his discomfort lingering in the air. Despite the tension, she kept her focus on her work. Her thoughts kept drifting to her upcoming meetings, the plans she had been working on for months, and the important business decisions that needed her attention. But no matter how hard she tried to push the captain's behavior to the back of her mind, it was hard to ignore the way he kept hovering near her seat. It was almost as if he was deliberately trying to provoke her. Then, about halfway through the flight, Captain Stone made another appearance. This time, he was walking towards the cockpit, but as he passed through the cabin, he made an unexpected stop right in front of Carmen's seat. He looked down at her, his face stern, and this time his voice was sharper than ever. "Miss," he said in a cold, commanding tone, "I've asked you several times to follow the rules, but it seems you're still not paying attention. You need to take your seatbelt off while you're working, or I'll have to report you." Carmen was stunned. She hadn't been wearing her seatbelt during the brief moments when she was standing or moving around, but she had been seated with it securely fastened for most of the flight. She knew the captain was trying to make a point, but it was becoming clear that he was no longer simply doing his job. Instead, he was becoming increasingly unprofessional. "Captain," Carmen said, keeping her voice calm but firm, "I've had my seatbelt on for most of the flight, and I'm not breaking any rules. I'm simply working on my computer. If there's a problem, I'm happy to talk about it. But I don't believe there's any need for further comments." But Captain Stone wasn't listening. His face flushed with irritation, and he crossed his arms as if he were making a final decision about her behavior. "I'm the captain here, and I'm telling you to stop ignoring me," he snapped, his voice rising a little. A few passengers around them exchanged uneasy glances. They had noticed the tension between Carmen and the captain, and some had started to feel uncomfortable. One man sitting a few rows behind stood up and began to approach the flight attendant, quietly asking if there was anything that could be done about the situation. The flight attendant, clearly caught in the middle, didn't know what to say. She was trying to do her job, but this was clearly beyond her. Carmen, though frustrated, tried to keep her composure. She didn't want to make the situation worse or draw even more attention, but she also knew that something had to be done. She had been respectful and patient, Yet the captain's attitude had only gotten worse. As Captain Stone turned and walked away, still muttering to himself, Carmen couldn't help but feel a sinking feeling in her stomach. She knew that this wasn't just about the seatbelt or the rules anymore. There was something more personal behind the captain's behavior, and it was clear that he was letting his own prejudice cloud his judgment. The flight, which had once felt like a simple business trip, had now become a battleground for something much larger. Carmen was determined to stay calm, but she could feel her frustration growing. She wasn't going to let this man continue to bully her, or anyone else, without standing up for what was right. As Flight 319 cruised steadily across the sky, Carmen's frustration was building. She had tried to stay calm, to ignore Captain Stone's rude behavior, but it was getting harder and harder to pretend it wasn't bothering her. The tension between them had gone from awkward to outright uncomfortable, and the captain's constant targeting of her was starting to feel personal. Carmen knew she couldn't let this continue without taking action. She took a deep breath and decided to make a call. She reached into her bag and grabbed her phone. It was one of the few things that could bring her peace in situations like this. Her father, Lucius Taylor, though she had never relied on his wealth to solve her problems, there were moments when his guidance and support were exactly what she needed. She dialed his number, waiting for the call to connect. "Carmen, is everything okay?" Her father's calm voice came through the phone after a few rings. Lucius Taylor, a man who had built an airline empire from the ground up, was a voice of reason in any situation. He was used to dealing with difficult people and complex problems, but he had always taught Carmen to handle things with dignity and strength. "Dad, I'm fine," Carmen replied, her voice steady despite the growing tension around her. "But I'm on this flight, and I've had some trouble with the captain. He's been rude to me for no reason, and it's getting out of hand." Lucius paused for a moment. He knew Carmen well enough to understand when something was truly bothering her. "What kind of trouble? Tell me exactly what's been happening." Carmen explained everything that had happened on the flight, how Captain Stone had treated her since she boarded, how he had made unnecessary and harsh comments, and how his behavior had escalated throughout the journey. She described the most recent encounter when he had angrily demanded she remove her seatbelt, despite following all the rules. "I just don't understand it, Dad," she said, frustration creeping into her voice. "I've done nothing wrong, and yet he keeps treating me like this." Lucius listened carefully, his mind already starting to process the situation. He knew his daughter's character well. She never overreacted, and she always tried to handle things on her own. But this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. Carmen wasn't the type of person to complain over small matters, and Lucius could hear the strain in her voice. "Carmen," he said after a moment, his tone firm but calm, "you've been patient, but it's clear this situation is beyond what you should be dealing with. I want you to stay calm, but I'm going to handle this. This captain needs to know his actions have consequences. You don't deserve this." Carmen felt a sense of relief wash over her. Her father's confidence and calmness always gave her strength. "What are you going to do?" she asked, grateful for his support. "I'll take care of it," Lucius replied. "I own the airline, Carmen. I'll make sure this gets handled immediately. Just stay where you are, and don't engage with him any further. I'll have someone contact the flight crew, and we'll address this issue as soon as possible." Carmen felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She knew her father wasn't the type to make idle threats. When he said something would be taken care of, it would be. As the call ended, Carmen took a deep breath and looked out the window, trying to clear her mind. She didn't want to escalate things, but she was relieved to know that her father had everything under control. As the plane continued its flight, Carmen settled back into her seat, feeling a little more at ease. She had done the right thing by calling her father, and now it was in his hands. But she knew one thing for certain. The captain's actions would not go unnoticed, and this situation would be resolved. The course of the flight had already changed, and soon the truth would come to light. Back at the airline's headquarters, things were moving quickly. Lucius Taylor didn't waste any time in handling the situation. The moment he got off the phone with his daughter, he immediately called the CEO of the airline, Victoria Harris. Victoria was a sharp and experienced leader, and Lucius knew she would take this matter seriously. The airline had a reputation to uphold, and they could not allow a situation like this to go unresolved. "Victoria, I need you to listen carefully," Lucius said when she answered the phone. His tone was calm, but there was a sense of urgency in his voice. "I've just spoken to my daughter, Carmen. She's on flight 319 right now, and there's been an issue with the captain. His behavior is completely unacceptable. I want you to launch an immediate investigation into what happened." Victoria listened intently, taking in every detail. She had been working with Lucius for years and had always admired his no-nonsense approach to business. She knew this situation had to be handled delicately, but there was no room for excuses when it came to professionalism and respect. She could hear the concern in Lucius's voice for his daughter, but she also knew the bigger picture. This wasn't just about one flight. It was about maintaining the airline's integrity. "I'll get the team on it right away," Victoria replied. "We'll gather all the information we can from the flight attendants, the passengers, and the crew. I'll make sure we get to the bottom of this." Lucius nodded, his mind already racing with the steps needed to handle a fallout. "I'm also going to speak with the board. We can't let this kind of behavior continue. It's bad for business, and it's bad for our passengers. Carmen doesn't deserve this, and I won't let it slide." Victoria agreed. She had already begun pulling up reports about Captain Edward Stone's history with the airline. It didn't take long for the team to find multiple complaints about his behavior over the years, remarks made to passengers, aggressive language used with staff, and a general lack of professionalism that had somehow been overlooked. The more they dug into his history, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated incident. Meanwhile, Carmen sat quietly on the plane, unaware of the rapid actions taking place on the ground. She had hoped her father would handle things, but she didn't expect it to happen so quickly. As she looked around at the other passengers, she could sense the unease in the air. Everyone had noticed Captain Stone's odd behavior, and it was clear that the tension was affecting everyone on board. Passengers were no longer whispering in hushed tones, but were openly talking to one another about what had happened. Some even began making notes on their phones, preparing to report the captain's actions. In the cockpit, Captain Stone remained oblivious to the storm that was brewing behind the scenes. He had no idea that the powerful forces of the airline's leadership were already moving against him. He continued to focus on his duties, unaware that his career was hanging in the balance. Back at the airline's headquarters, Victoria was already drafting a statement for the media. She knew this situation could escalate quickly, and they needed to be prepared. As the minutes ticked by, the airline's top executives were gathering the facts, piecing together a full account of what had happened on Flight 319. They had a plan to address the issue, and soon, Captain Stone would learn that there were consequences for actions like his. Carmen's father, Lucius, wasn't the type to let things slide. The airline would respond, and the truth would be revealed. But there was still much to do, and the path ahead was just beginning to unfold. As Flight 319 continued on its way to Los Angeles, Captain Edward Stone remained unaware that his career was quickly crumbling. He focused on flying the plane, checking the controls, and monitoring the cabin from the cockpit. In his mind, nothing had changed. He was still in charge, still the captain, and nothing would challenge that. But in the background, things were already shifting. Back at the airline's headquarters, the investigation into Captain Stone's behavior was moving faster than expected. The airline's management had already begun reviewing the flight attendants' reports and passenger statements. It was clear from the testimonies that Captain Stone had crossed several lines. His treatment of Carmen had been rude, unprofessional, and most troubling of all, personal. His actions hadn't just been a one-time mistake. They were part of a growing pattern of behavior that had been overlooked for far too long. Victoria Harris, the CEO of the airline, was leading the charge. She was a no-nonsense leader who knew that when an issue like this arose, It had to be handled swiftly and decisively. Her team had already gathered evidence that Captain Stone had received multiple complaints in the past from both passengers and crew members, all related to his attitude and conduct. His arrogant and dismissive behavior had been brushed aside for years, but now it was coming back to haunt him. Victoria called a meeting with the airline's senior staff. As they gathered around the table, she looked at the reports and the pile of information that had been collected. It was clear that Captain Stone had a history of causing tension on flights, making passengers feel uncomfortable, and showing little respect for the rules and authority of others. His attitude had become a liability to the company, and they could no longer ignore it. Captain Stone's actions today are unacceptable, Victoria said firmly, addressing her team. We've known about his past issues, but it's time to take action. We can't allow this kind of behavior to continue. We have to protect our passengers and our reputation. The room was quiet as everyone absorbed the weight of the situation. The airline had built its reputation on providing excellent service and treating customers with respect. But now it was clear that one man's behavior was threatening to undo all of that. As the investigation continued, they discovered that Captain Stone's problems weren't just limited to his interactions with passengers. His relationships with his colleagues and crew members had also been strained. Many had quietly complained about his leadership style, which had been described as overly authoritative and dismissive. Some even mentioned feeling uncomfortable around him, fearing that he might escalate situations unnecessarily. The pieces were all falling into place. It was clear that Captain Stone had been given multiple chances, but this time there would be no more leniency. The airline could no longer afford to let him continue in his role. They had to act, and they had to act fast. Meanwhile, Carmen had no idea that the wheels of justice were already turning. She sat in her seat, her thoughts occupied with the business meeting she had scheduled for when she arrived in Los Angeles. She was determined not to let the incident with the captain affect her day. But as the hours passed, the tension on the plane seemed to grow thicker. Passengers who had witnessed the captain's rude behavior were beginning to discuss the situation openly, and word was slowly spreading that something big was about to happen. The air was thick with uncertainty, and all eyes seemed to be on Captain Stone, who continued to fly the plane, unaware that the consequences of his actions were already being set in motion. His career was about to change, and he would soon learn that actions like his could not go unnoticed. The storm that had been quietly brewing was about to break. By the time Flight 319 was nearing its destination in Los Angeles, things had reached a boiling point. Carmen Taylor had always been someone who handled conflicts with grace, but the events of this flight had pushed her to her limits. She could feel the tension in the air, and she knew the situation was far from over. Little did Captain Stone know, his actions were already being investigated, and soon he would face the consequences of his behavior. As the flight descended, Captain Stone walked through the cabin one final time. The passengers were preparing for landing, but there was a noticeable unease in the atmosphere. Some passengers exchanged glances, and others were quietly discussing what had happened earlier. The word had spread about the captain's rude behavior, and many were uncomfortable. But it wasn't until the plane touched down that things truly started to unfold. When the plane finally landed, Carmen stood up, gathering her belongings. She had been dreading the moment when she would step off the plane, but she knew it was time to face what had happened. As the other passengers disembarked, a flight attendant quietly approached her and handed her a note. It was from the airline's customer relations team, asking her to stay behind for a moment. Carmen felt a sense of calm wash over her. She had expected this, and she knew it meant the situation was being taken seriously. She waited as the other passengers left, and soon a senior manager from the airline approached her. "Ms. Taylor, I'm so sorry for what you've experienced today," the manager said with a sincere expression. "We've already started an investigation into the captain's behavior. We take this matter very seriously, and we will ensure that the necessary steps are taken." Carmen nodded, grateful for the airline's swift response. "Thank you. I appreciate your understanding. I trust that the issue will be handled properly." As Carmen left the plane and made her way to the airport terminal, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from her father, Lucius Taylor. She opened it and read the brief but powerful message. "I've spoken to the board. They're moving fast on this. Don't worry. It will be dealt with." Lucius had always been a man of his word. Carmen knew that her father's influence and the swift action of the airline's leadership would ensure that the captain's behavior would not go unpunished. The storm was brewing, and it was clear that Captain Stone's actions would soon be exposed. Within hours, the story of what had happened on Flight 319 had gone viral. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, the public was buzzing with questions about the airline and its response to the captain's conduct. People were shocked to hear about the captain's behavior and were eager to know how the airline would handle the situation. In response, the airline issued a public statement. "We deeply regret the events that occurred on Flight 319. Our passengers deserve the highest level of respect, and we take full responsibility for the actions of our staff. We are conducting a thorough investigation and will take appropriate actions to ensure that this never happens again." The statement sent shockwaves through the public, and soon, people were demanding answers. How had this captain been allowed to continue in his position for so long? Why had his previous behavior been overlooked? The airline's reputation, once solid, was now at risk. But as the investigation moved forward, it became clear that the company was serious about making things right. Meanwhile, Captain Stone was facing the fallout of his actions. Behind closed doors, his career was unraveling. His previous misconduct, now revealed to the public, had sealed his fate. The company had no choice but to remove him from his position. The airline could not afford to keep someone with his attitude at the helm, especially when they were facing public scrutiny. Carmen, meanwhile, kept her focus on the bigger picture. She had trusted that the airline would do the right thing. And now, it was clear that the company was committed to ensuring this type of behavior would not be tolerated. The world was watching, and the consequences for Captain Stone were only just beginning. The events of Flight 319 were still fresh in the minds of the passengers, the crew, and everyone who had followed the story in the news. Captain Edward Stone had made a costly mistake, and now the airline was working hard to repair its reputation. But for Carmen Taylor, the situation had finally come to a close, at least as far as the public eye was concerned. However, there was one thing she was certain of. This experience had shown her just how much influence she had, not just because of her family's wealth, but because of her strong sense of right and wrong. As soon as Carmen had landed in Los Angeles, she had been contacted by her father, Lucius Taylor, who had been overseeing the investigation from the start. "It's all being handled," he assured her when they spoke on the phone. "We've already removed Captain Stone from his position. The airline has learned its lesson." Carmen felt a mixture of relief and pride. She had expected no less from her father and the company. The public statement from the airline had been clear. Captain Stone's behavior was unacceptable, and the company was taking full responsibility for what had happened. They had promised to implement new training for all employees, ensuring that something like this would never happen again. But Carmen knew that it wasn't just about the captain. It was about respect. Respect for passengers, respect for people of all backgrounds, and respect for doing the right thing. The fallout from the incident didn't stop there. News outlets continued to cover the story, with many people praising the airline for taking swift action. Social media was flooded with discussions about the importance of standing up against mistreatment and discrimination, and many saw Carmen as an example of grace under pressure. She had chosen to handle the situation without escalating it further, and the company had followed through by holding the captain accountable. Despite the attention, Carmen stayed focused on her business. She wasn't in the spotlight because of her wealth or her father's name, but because of how she had dealt with the issue with dignity and professionalism. The incident had made her realize that sometimes, even the most unexpected situations could have a profound impact on the future. She had always worked hard to earn her success, But now, people were seeing her for who she truly was, someone who stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. As for Captain Stone, his career in the airline industry was over. His past mistakes had caught up with him, and there was no way for him to avoid the consequences of his actions. The company had released a statement explaining that Stone's removal was based on a pattern of unprofessional behavior that had gone unnoticed for too long. His actions on Flight 319 had been the tipping point. For Carmen, the whole experience was a reminder that actions have consequences and that respect must always come first. She knew that this story wouldn't define her, but it had certainly shown others what kind of person she was. Her father had always taught her to value integrity above all else, and in that moment, Carmen had proven that she could uphold those values, even when faced with an unexpected challenge. The airline made major changes in its operations, introducing new training on professionalism and passenger relations. The company promised that this incident would be a turning point for them, and many people felt that it was a positive step forward. The lesson learned was simple but profound. Respect is earned, and when it is lost, it is not easily regained. For Carmen Taylor, the outcome of this situation was clear. Standing up for what was right had made a difference, and it would continue to guide her path forward.